Shevlin, and I am the director of the Center for Book History, Westchester University Center for Book History. We've been around for, probably about 6 years, but we had a little hiatus and we're resurrecting things again. And I'm so pleased that this is our very first event of the academic year 2020-2021. And I know that we can look forward to much exciting programming. Westchester University has such a rich site, both in its libraries and its holdings, and the hand presses that we have to do printing and craft work, and in the expertise we have from manuscript culture, and that involves transcription, all the way through the digital. In fact, I think the digital has been an impetus in many ways for the start of a field known as book history. It's a bit of a misnomer because it also covers literacy, censorship, the book as a material artifact, newspapers, magazines, manuscripts, writing instruments, and so much more. It also deals with the history of authorship, its readers, book reviews, libraries. At our center, both in the past and in the future to come, we would like to feature public talks like this, in which we bring some of the work being done in special collections and in our classrooms and in among our faculty and grad students and undergrad students to the forefront, so people can see the important work in humanities and throughout. It's a very interdisciplinary field that's taking place. And we also hope to offer both craft demonstrations and perhaps even participation opportunities. We have wanted to do paper making, but we've never been able to get that here yet. We also are very interested in working with the community in partnerships. And I should stress that the field is a very inclusive, diverse field. So there are amazing things in book history that go on everywhere from South Africa to India to Native American, down through all historical periods, from clay tablets to our iPads, and then some. So I hope that you will come, and I actually, after that rendition of what book history consists of, we probably have plenty of topics to keep us busy for many a Tuesday evening if we so choose. But tonight I am delighted to turn things over now to the director of our special collections, Professor Ron McColl, and he is going to be presenting, chairing the panel on transcribing William Darlington. And I'll just give it to you now.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Shevlin. Can everyone hear me okay? Thumbs up. And I see some head nods. That's great. Okay. So I'm going to present a little PowerPoint that will introduce us to Darlington. And then it always takes a second. It's always a little hitch here when I do this. And then I'm going to introduce you to some students who worked on this project this summer. So hopefully you will learn a lot about what they learned and also learn a lot about Darlington. So I'm going to try and pack a lot of information in here in a short time. We're also going to have a period at the end for questions. So without further ado, I'll get started. And everyone sees my PowerPoint? Okay, great. So thank you, Eleanor, and thank you to everyone who's joining us this evening. It's my pleasure to introduce you to William Darlington and 3 outstanding student scholars who this summer helped us bring his words into the 21st century. For those of you not from Chester County or not familiar with 19th century botany, the name William Darlington may mean very little. Of course, we have a lot of Darlingtons with us this evening, so I guess his name means a lot to some of you, of course. Not long ago, I fit both of those categories myself, but when I came to Westchester, I was immediately drawn to our extensive holdings of his papers, personal library, artifacts, and even herbarium, the collection of roughly 15,000 plant specimens sent to him from around the world from many collectors. In all, our Darlingtonia provided a fascinating glimpse into 19th century science and a whole lot more. When we faced the sudden and unpleasant experience of closing special collections this spring, I wasn't sure there was enough remote work to keep our staff and students busy. But then I recalled that I had taken preliminary scans of Darlington's letterbooks and realized that we might all be able to work together instead, something, by the way, we rarely get to do when we are on site. So, Transcribing William Darlington was born. But let's begin with the birth of the man himself. The Chester County Archives recently launched a wonderful digital project titled the 1777 Chester County Property Atlas. The atlas depicts the property lines and homesteads in many of the county's townships at the time of the Battle of Brandywine in 1777. The maps also include details about whether British troops plundered a farm during the battle, or if the colonial government performed similar acts as attacks on the largely Quaker population that generally refused to participate in the war effort. Less than 5 years after the battle, William Darlington was born on a farm along the Brandywine Creek, a property clearly outlined on the atlas. It is obvious that Darlington would have spent much of his youth steeped in the lore and collecting the artifacts of a legendary American conflict waged right on his family's farm. As a Quaker, Darlington attended Birmingham Meeting House and studied at a nearby academy under John Forsyth. By 17, his education mostly complete, Darlington was poised to become a farmer politician like his father, but a serendipitous encounter at an apothecary shop in Delaware led him to pursue a career in medicine. William set off for Wilmington as apprentice to Dr. John Vaughan. In the years that followed, he would rehearse the tropes of a Renaissance man. Darlington taught himself or acquired tutelage in several foreign languages. He closely studied Wilmington politics and befriended many of the leading political figures who passed through Dr. Vaughan's office. He enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School and fell under the spell of Benjamin Smith Barton, the country's premier professor of materia medica. He courted Catherine Lacey, the daughter of a Revolutionary War general, who dismissed Darlington as beneath his daughter's dignity. He filled volumes with his original poems and songs and played the flute when he wasn't singing. He even performed a legendary measure of heroics when, of all the medical practitioners in the city, only he and Dr. Vaughan remained behind to treat Wilmington's citizenry during the 1802 yellow fever epidemic. Yet upon returning home to practice medicine, he discovered there were few paying patients to be found. Darlington was forced to supplement his income for services rendered, which often came in the form of barter, with positions as physician to the county poorhouse and surgeon with the county militia. Such hustling was typical of any rural doctor of the time, but while some costs were merely financial, others were more personal. He earned less than $250 the year that the Birmingham meeting read him out of its membership for his work with the militia. Despite such dim prospects, Darlington took the significant step of starting a letter book in 1805. Preserved for his own reference and perhaps with a prescient eye toward posterity, Darlington would eventually record hundreds of letters, filling 4 volumes by the time he died. He entered his first letter as a newly minted doctor. His correspondent was no less than Thomas Jefferson. Presuming the president would be interested, and recognizing in Jefferson a kindred spirit and product of the Enlightenment, Darlington enclosed his freshly printed medical dissertation. "Much respected sir," he wrote, "knowing your predilection for all subjects which have any relation to or influence over the welfare of man, I have presumed to obtrude the accompanying sheets upon your view. Another inducement to this intrusion upon your time and pursuits, although perhaps less pertinent, yet no less pleasing, is that I may declare with how much respect and esteem I am your sincere, though unknown friend, William Darlington." Such acts of epistolary courage, self-deprecating intrusion, and pronounced flattery might largely have been remnants of a prior century, but they would be hallmarks of Darlington's correspondence, much like his use of the long S until his death in 1863. In the fall of 1806, Darlington was suffering from the dual rejections of his marriage proposal and his church membership. To prove himself to General Lacy, and perhaps himself, he signed on as surgeon for a merchant ship bound for Calcutta. His contract was to last 3 years, but Jefferson's embargo cut his time short, and he was home a little more than 12 months later. Darlington was 25 years old, and thanks to the profitable sale of fine linens he had procured during the trip, he had the money to buy a home and office in Westchester. Finally settled again in 1807, he married Catherine and returned to medical practice. During the next 2 decades, Darlington practiced medicine, started several businesses, served 3 terms as a United States congressman, and with Catherine raised a growing family. In his mid-40s, done with politics and stirred by his old love of botany, he produced and privately printed a local flora entitled Florula Sestrica. When it appeared in 1826, Darlington wasted no time sending copies to the few botanical acquaintances he already knew, and even more important ones he didn't. The response was positive and invigorating. Many more book-length publications would follow, including additional floras, practical studies of agricultural botany, and some of the earliest memorials of American botanists, such as John Bartram, Humphrey Marshall, and William Baldwin. Sadly, many of Darlington's most intimate friends and mentors would never live to see him achieve his greatest success. William Baldwin, the classmate and friend who had nursed Darlington during a near-fatal fever in 1803, had died of consumption at age 40 while serving as a botanist to the Long expedition. John Vaughan, the doctor who had trained Darlington in Wilmington and planned to pass his practice on to the returning sailor in 1807, died suddenly that same year at the age of 32. And Benjamin Smith Barton, the professor after whom Darlington named his son, did not live to see 50. Indeed, Darlington was well aware of his own mortality. In letters written during the last 3 decades of his life, he continually anticipates his own passing, suggesting it may come at any time. He would live long enough for Asa Gray to pronounce him the Nestor of American botany, however, in a letter to the great British botanist Sir William Jackson Hooker. As a doctor, Darlington knew how precious life was. He lived his to the fullest and provided the means for countless others to do the same. Perhaps Darlington's greatest contribution is the one that continues to this day. In all, he mentored, taught, wrote letters of introduction for, and gave books to scores of aspiring young people. This summer, nearly 160 years since his death, he inspired a whole new generation. For the transcribers on our team, his archives here at Westchester University offered a unique opportunity to get to know the man, his work, and the times he lived in. It's my pleasure to now introduce to you 3 emerging scholars who will share what they learned while transcribing his letters. We had several people work on this project. 3 student volunteers stepped forward for this evening's presentation, and they're all wonderful. One more slide here, and then I'm going to introduce them. First, we will hear from Chris Burrows, a senior English major at Westchester. In the spring of 2020, Chris received the Westchester University Cares Grant to study our children's literature collection. Chris has published articles in the Quad, WCU student newspaper, interned as a marketing and web designer with Music Service Learning, a nonprofit dedicated to connecting music students and faculty during the pandemic, and presented during WCU's Research Day. Next, you'll meet Kelli Billings. Kelli holds 2 BAs, one in French and another in history, which she just earned from Westchester in 2019. Currently, she is studying for her master's in history at Westchester. Kelli has won the Dreyer Scholarship and was also awarded a graduate assistantship. For the past year, she has been researching early printed books in special collections. Kelli serves as the graduate student member of the WCU Center for Book History Executive Committee. Finally, we'll hear from Chris Sassaris, a 2020 graduate of WCU's English department and current master's student in English at Villanova University. Chris first came to special collections as a researcher at WCU's Summer Undergraduate Research Institute. He has interned at the Library Company of Philadelphia and with the academic journal College Literature, a journal of critical literary studies. Chris has presented at several conferences, including Penn State University's Early Period Studies Group, and most recently at the East Central American Society for 18th Century Studies. Each student will tell us what they learned from the transcription project and share the impressions the particular letters made on them. After all three speakers have finished, we'll take your questions. Feel free to type them into the chat in the meantime while you're listening, or you can do that at the end. We should have plenty of time to do that then. So without further ado, Chris Burrows, start us off.
Thank you, Professor McColl. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity as well, not only to present, but thank you to the Darlington family who joined tonight for allowing me to go through your family members' letters. And it's it was really interesting to go through that this summer, or actually spring. I learned a lot while transcribing the letters of William Darlington. Specifically, one of the things that I learned was how important it is to establish common rules when you're transcribing letters with other people. We established a folder so that we were able to learn what other people had done, and so that we didn't duplicate each other's letters, duplicate work, so that we could actually get more done. And I also learned to double check anything that I wasn't sure of. So there was a word that I didn't know or something that I wasn't quite sure, wasn't quite clear. I reached out to somebody with more expertise than I had, so that I could learn what I needed to do. And then if something like that came up in the future, I would be better at transcribing that. Some of the things that I noticed about William Darlington's letters, he had a fantastic personality. And one of the things that I saw, that he was very polite to anyone that he wrote to. He always ended letters with "Dear Sir," "Dear Madam," "Your most obedient servant." And I think it just shows what kind of person he was as a congressman, as a botanist, as a poet, so many different things that he was a part of. And I think that was really special to see just how much he was polite in that art of letter writing that we don't really see that much anymore. One of the things that I also noticed was that he used unusual abbreviations in his letters. For example, he abbreviated Pennsylvania, PENNA, period, and also saw obedient, OBEDT. And I also noticed that he used dashes and parentheses quite frequently, especially dashes. And I actually find that maybe I'm related to him in some way, because I use dashes all the time in my own writing to make one sentence probably about 5 lines long. Something that I found particularly interesting as I was going through the letters, I think one of the ones that made me laugh was his letter to John Tory from December 7th, 1833, in which he was talking about a botanist that he hadn't yet met overseas. And he asked John Tory to give him a full portrait of what the man looked like give me his dress, his appearance, his height, all these things. And he said, in short, botanical gossip, a letter full of botanical gossip. I thought that was really interesting to get to know his personality a little bit. Perhaps on a more important note, what I really enjoyed seeing was how much that he encouraged poetry and botany, especially for young women. This was a time in which young women were not really encouraged to pursue these professions. I think especially with literature, I think of the Bronte sisters, who still had to use male pseudonyms because it was not considered acceptable for them to write, even though their talent was impeccable. I think it's just amazing, especially to see with Lucy Richardson and the entire Richardson family. He really encouraged Lucy to write, and he really encouraged her to participate in the Young Ladies Botanical Society, which was formed in Wilmington at the time. A particular letter that also stood out to me was his letter to Bayard Taylor on February 21st, 1844, largely for local reasons. The Bayard Taylor Library, of course, in Kennett is named after Bayard Taylor. And I think it's also interesting, again, to see how much he enjoyed not only reading poetry, but also encouraging others to pursue their passion for poetry. So in conclusion, I'm really thankful for the opportunity that I had to go through William Darlington's letters. I enjoyed seeing all of the many pursuits that he was involved in, his warm personality, and his sense of humor coming out from time to time. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. That was interesting. I had no idea what they're going to say tonight, so I'm hearing all this for the first time too, and it's a lot of fun. Okay, Kelly, you're up.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm going to be looking down at my notes, so forgive me. So as Ron said, I work with the early printed books in special collections, so those go up to 1800. And so this project was really interesting for me because it kind of starts around 1800, and it gave me some experience with time periods that I don't normally study. So the letters that I did ranged from 1816 to 1834. So it's really going beyond what I normally do. So that was cool. So I have some my experience was colored by what I have done already with special collections with the earlier books. So for example, the scripts in like 16th and 17th century books, I kind of have developed an eye to read, although it's challenging a lot. So in comparison, Darlington's script and handwriting was really easy to read, so it was kind of refreshing. And it was my first time working with correspondence as a primary source. So being able to kind of jump into ongoing conversations between real people who were talking about stuff that was going on in their real lives, like that is what I'm really interested in about history, is the real, regular people. And so obviously Darlington was pretty exceptional, but he's still a regular person. And it's important to me as a historian that knowledge and resources are available to the public as much as possible. And so my very, very, very small role in this project is something that contributes to that sort of thing. And it's a good example of taking a lot of primary source material and turning it into a digital humanities project, which I think I'm going to be doing a lot of as I get further into my career. I had an easy time for the most part reading the handwriting, but there were a couple times where it wasn't clear, especially with like botanical jargon that I wasn't very familiar with anyway. So for example, the small suborbicular sinuate dentate leaves that have a tendency to radicate at the base of the petioles when lying on the ground. That's a fun sentence, but I guess every profession has some version of suborbicular I already forgot, sinuate dentate leaves. So there's this idea that kind of stuff seems so foreign to me, but for this whole group of botanists, that's normal conversation. And so that's a really interesting window to get into that too. Most of the letters that I did were business kind of things. And so what I really enjoyed was the little, glimpses that you can get here and there of Darlington's personality. So the letters that I'm going to talk about have some examples of those. The first one actually, as Chris had one from to John Tory, I have one too. And it was written in June of 1827. And at this time, Tory was a professor of chemistry at West Point. And I thought that the opening was just delightful, so I'll read that too. Being interrupted from my haymaking by a rainy day, I have concluded to sit down and have a little botanical confab with you by way of renewing the pleasures of my late visit to West Point. So I love botanical confabs. Like I want to have that now with somebody. This letter was the longest one that I did. It was 4 pages of the scans from the letter book. So it's really technical. He's talking about all these plants that he's found recently, and by the end, he explains that he's been called away and he has to cut the letter short. And then he says, doubtless to your great relief, which made me laugh, and I wondered if John Tory laughed at it too. Another letter that I enjoyed was written in February of 1820 to John Trumbull, who was a poet from Connecticut. And we heard earlier about Darlington's appreciation for poetry. So this is a little note that he wrote to John with some money to say that he wants to pre-order this book. And will you please have a copy sent to me at Westchester when it comes out? It was a book of poetry that was going to come out soon. And it's really cool because you could tell that he was really excited to get this book. And it doesn't, as far as I know, have anything to do with botany at all. So I'm highlighting this because it kind of gives a glimpse into Darlington as more than just a botanist, which we know he was, but it's something else that he was interested in, and I thought that was really cool. Finally, I transcribed one letter that was written to William Darlington by a Frenchman, Charles Martin, in September of 1834. I wasn't able to see the letter that Darlington had written to him initially, but from what I gather, that was written in English, and then Charles responded in French, saying, your English is good enough, or my English is good enough to understand what you wrote, and I don't have any, what did he say? I don't have any samples of plants or trees that are found in America. And so if you would be so kind as to send me some, I would love that, especially if they don't grow in France. So this is cool because it shows that Darlington was part of this international network of botanists, and that because of him, Westchester was an important point in this network. So to sum up, this project was kind of new territory for me in a lot of ways, but I was able to use a lot of the skills that I've developed in special collections for this. And so it is something that I might not have found my way to on my own, but I'm really glad that I did.
Great, thank you, Kelly. Yeah, a lot of people didn't think they'd be working on this summer, but then we were faced with no choice. So I'm glad you liked it. All right, so we have one more Chris. His actual name is Christoforos, but we all call him Chris, and he's gonna wrap things up with the student presentations, and then we're happy to answer questions after that.
Hello, everyone. So yeah, I feel like a lot of the things that I learned, I share with the other two students who spoke a lot of it about the time period. And I want to mention a couple of things specifically that kind of stood out to me. First thing is, as Mr. McColl said, this was my second time kind of working in special collections, and the first time with the Summer Undergraduate Research Institute, one of the things I really had trouble with was understanding handwriting with some of the archives. So that was one of the sort of major difficulties I had in that, not this summer, but the one before. So it was really good getting a lot of time to work with handwriting, especially cursive handwriting, because that really, I definitely adjusted to it with every letter. So that was one of the things I learned. Also, a lot of epistolary conventions that I wasn't as familiar with, like the INST for of this month, and how to write the plural of Mr. and things like that. And these things, besides the sort of being interesting, although I don't think I'll personally use them in writing, I thought they're interesting for research purposes and for sort of researching primary sources, both in the master's degree I'm pursuing and in general in different careers in librarianship and similar places. So another thing I really enjoyed was sort of really getting a sense of how these digital collections are put together, because as a student at Westchester, I really used a lot of databases, used a lot of online tools that just sort of have the source on there, and I can always click Control F and just find whatever it is that I want to find in 2 seconds. But I never really had appreciated the what goes behind what goes into putting these databases or these online collections together. And it was really cool being a part of this team, and also getting that behind the scenes look and of all the steps that go into putting collections like these together, that a lot of the time I had taken kind of for granted before. So as I said, the epistolary conventions were one of the new sort of technical things I took away from this project. Another thing, and this might not be true for most people, but I was actually not very familiar with some of the terminology, the Quaker sort of ways of speaking from the time. And when I started seeing some of the these and thous, for example, popping up, I thought he was being very formal, and I was trying to sort of philosophize like a very specific reason of why he would use this rhetorically in some way. And then we had a meeting, and we all sort of mentioned things that were new to us, and that was one of mine. And I quickly found out that this would have been more typical than I imagined. So yeah, these are just some few of the many interesting new things I learned during the project. And another thing I found particularly interesting was a lot of the time when we think of people traveling globally or having a sense of what's happening in very distant sort of parts of the world from where they are, I typically, at least for me, I typically think of the 20th century and 21st century a lot of the time. But there were a few sort of mentions that sort of got me thinking, oh, this really is like a more globalized sort of context than I had imagined before. Like one of them was obviously the discourse with this international botanical community. We already mentioned some of the big names in that, but there were, different from different countries. Another one was that there was a letter where Darlington's son was going to, Darlington was requesting that his son, who was in the Navy, get 18 months off to go to France and Spain, and the reason listed was to improve his use of those two the languages of those two countries. So that was interesting to me. And there was even a mention of the 1821 revolution in Greece, and sort of some people, there was a group trying to collect funds for that in Philadelphia. So I didn't expect it to get sort of global sense of this. In this time period, which is very interesting. So I was going to turn to a couple of specific letters. So from the first one, I want to read from it verbatim, but it was, I will from the second one. But the first one was from Darlington to Mahlon Dickerson, Secretary of the Navy, and it was the one I just mentioned a minute ago. Yeah, actually, I realized I said everything I was going to say about that. I got ahead of myself while looking at the notes. So I'll turn to the second one, which was interesting for a couple of reasons. And it was from William Darlington to J.B. Lippincott and Company in Philadelphia, the publisher. And it was, it's dated October 18th, 1858. So there were a couple of reasons why this was very interesting to me. One of them was that I was fascinated by the idea that a reader can write to a publisher and actually be heard and then get a response, because obviously some of that, it's on a much larger scale now. And I could never imagine just sending a letter to, I don't know, W.W. Norton, just as me, just some reader. So that was really interesting. But another thing was that I think this letter, and specifically the part that I will read, is particularly interesting because it touches on the role of naming places and naming institutions in history and in historiography too, and how sort of the different groups in an area, so how that relates to the histories of different groups in a single area. So this is specifically about the name of different places as Christiana, and I don't know if this relates to Christiana Mall, for example, but I wouldn't be surprised. So Darlington reached out to Lippincott about an error that he found in the book called The Pronouncing Gazetteer of the World. And he really praises the book, and actually sort of compares it to Webster's dictionary and says it's sort of like a standard work that he always references. But then he has to, he goes on and points an error, and specifically quotes Swedish historian J. Campanius Holm to argue what I'm about to read. So I'll read one of the paragraphs that I thought was interesting. So, and now to the point in view, Messrs. Thomas and Baldwin were doubtless aware that the early Swedish settlers on the banks of the Delaware and its tributaries were very fond of giving the name of their celebrated queen, Christina, to the places and works and institutions where they established themselves in the county of Newcastle, Delaware, and hence the frequent occurrence of that name. But in compiling the Gazetteer, the editors seem to have overlooked this fact and have implicitly adopted the unwarrantable orthography employed by the English immigrants who succeeded the first settlers. Thus, the Gazetteer constantly describes places and objects which were originally and distinctly named Christina under the corruptly modified appellation of Christiana, thereby producing historical confusion where all was once plain and intelligible. The colonists of that region all used and were familiar with the name Christina, or as they pronounced it in the vernacular, Christine, but no one in those days ever heard the term Christiana in conversation. So that was the end of that paragraph. Yeah, I thought it was very interesting about sort of the way, I think it's one fascinating example about sort of the way naming of places is. There's a lot more history behind it a lot of the time, and sort of conflicting histories behind that. So I thought that was really fascinating. I didn't even know there was a prominent Swedish presence sort of along the Delaware. So that was really interesting to me. So yeah, that was the last mention, the last letter I wanted to mention, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Chris. So thanks for those highlights on particular letters. There's too many for me to read, so this is how I'm going to actually get to read the letters. So I get a bunch of people to read them and then tell stories about them. So I don't know if we have questions coming in yet. If we do, we can start to take those. And I don't know, Dr. Shevlin, if you want to throw them out, and then I guess
we have, yes, certainly. This one comes in from Maureen McCadden. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. I need the Lippincott pronouncing gazetteer. Can you speak to your process? Was there software involved, and how did you hand in your transcriptions?
Okay, well, I'll just say to start that we didn't use any transcription software. So this was a pretty manual process from the beginning. And I guess mainly because the benefit is what you see tonight. So students could learn a lot and actually work with these letters. Also, I think the quality was probably much better. Having a set of eyes and then a second set of eyes as proofreaders come along, I have much more confidence in the transcription than I would even if we did use, you know, the latest and greatest software. That said, we did have a pretty elaborate workflow that when we graphed it out for another presentation looked a lot more complicated than it probably was, but we're happy to, I don't know if one of the students wants to talk about their process and what they saw at their end. Who wants to take that? I just sort of put the stuff up, and Jenna was is our technician in special collections. She managed things as they came and went as well. She's here with us. But the students did something on their own. Chris, you want to talk about what you did?
Yeah, so
Chris and both raise their hands. Go ahead, sorry. Go ahead, Chris.
oh, should I go? Okay. Yeah, in an ideal world, I would have printed out everything and while transcribing it. Of course, I would have only done that if I had access to Campus and being able to use my prints in that way. So what I did do, one thing I found helped and sped the process up was using two screens. So I had like a smaller kind of laptop in front of me. That was sort of the transcription screen. And then there was the one that I pulled up. The larger screen was the like the TV sized screen was the one that I used for pulling up the letters, because sometimes some of the letters might be very clear, but sometimes like there's Darlington will like run a room on the page, and there might be something that's a little harder to read kind of on the corner. So then I can sort of zoom out and have the larger image. So that was the most noteworthy thing I think about the way I transcribe these.
Christopher, did you have anything to add?
I think also I just wanted to echo also what Chris had just said. Working on two screens was an absolute lifesaver because it was really helpful, I think, to have both screens up in front of you where you have the transcription on one side, you could just type it on the other side. I also found it really helpful to actually try to read it out loud while I was typing it, and that also helped me proofread it because I use that in every paper that I do, just reading out loud to kind of make sure that I had everything accurate. And then of course, you know, a second person would proofread it just to make sure that I had done that correctly. I think that definitely was a big help. And the Excel spreadsheet that we had was also helpful. We could actually sign, okay, I'm going to take this letter, and then somebody else will proofread it. I think that was also really helpful, and I think it saved a lot of time as well.
So to clarify, basically we ended up using Google Drive and had a folder for the Darlington Letters project. And then we had folders within there. One was of the scanned images, each letter that was ready to go. And within there, we also had each transcriber could pull those images to their individual folders. and we had Excel sheets that kind of marked all the different correspondences and kind of tagged who took what and when they completed it.
So it's great record keeping. And it's interesting too, because of course we had to do this from the pandemic. You had to work with the digital, and it probably would have been better to work with the digital anyway. However, I think in some cases with needed clarification, ink blots and things like that, the material text, the original, can be very important to view in certain cases. So the digital is offering a new component, but it doesn't necessarily replace it. But of course, in something like today's pandemic, it enabled the project. Without that, we wouldn't have had this. I see a whole lot of questions. I don't know if I'll let Brad go first. I think some of these you're going to be needing to answer too, Ron. Did Darlington make copies of all of the correspondences he sent? And how did Westchester come to have these letters?
Great questions. No, he definitely did not record all his correspondence in his letter book. It's hard for me to determine what the system was, but certainly with the leading figures that he corresponded with, they made it in the book. There are some minor letters and topics that you wouldn't think would necessarily rise to that level in there as well. But what is a strong indication that he certainly didn't record everything is that there are no letters to family members in the letter books. We have some loose letters, but for the most part, so all his family-based correspondence. I shouldn't say none, but there are very few. And if you were to visit, for instance, the Chester County Historical Society, you would find they have many, many loose letters that he wrote. So we know that they were sent to others and they ended up in their collections, and they're not in the letter books. So I couldn't even give you an estimate on the percentage. When Darlington died, his papers were divided. The library we have is his scientific library, and the picture I showed was just a portion of it, several hundred volumes in total. His papers were put up for auction around 1900 by his grandson in New York City. And at that point, the collection was divided into at least 3 large chunks, and some smaller pieces as well were auctioned. One significant portion of it went to the New York Historical Society. And so what they have regarding correspondence is all of the incoming correspondence that Darlington saved. And he would bind these into bound volumes, and there are, I think, 10 volumes of incoming correspondence. I've been dying to get up there, but I couldn't make it this summer. I couldn't go anywhere. Another third or so of what was left was given to the Chester County Historical Society, and then the other third was given to the university. And of course, we're only a mile apart, so why would that happen? Well, that's because George Morris Phillips, who was our principal at the time at the normal school, who was a very literary minded man in the first place, saw to it that he was going to go to New York and he was going to get as much of this as he could. And he was actually president of the Historical Society at the time, so it meant something to him to bring items back for them. And so he made another division. And so, for instance, we have 3 of the 4 letter book volumes. They have another one at the Chester County Historical Society. And you can kind of go down piece by piece. They've got some things, we have some things. And then some other things ended up in Kansas and, you know, here and there and everywhere. So it's much more complicated than that, but that hopefully get you an answer to get you started.
Now we have a question from Richard Darlington, and he's wondering if there is any letters preserved between William and George Pierce as he helped lay out what we know today as Longwood Gardens.
We don't have any correspondence between Darlington and the Pierces that I'm aware of, and I'm not sure. I should say we don't have any, and I'm not aware of there being any. And of course, they would have been a bit before Darlington's time. I mean, their lives would have overlapped, but they would have been, I'm going to say, the 1790s or so. Their arboretum was being installed and so on and built. But what we do have are herbarium sheets or specimens that Darlington obtained from Pierce's Gardens. So, which, you know, he was referring to then obviously as Pierce's Gardens of Pierce Brothers. So I'd say we have a few dozen specimens that were collected from the original arboretum at the Pierce Brothers, which eventually would become Longwood Gardens in the 20th century.
This query comes from Deirdre Cooper Owens, and she first commends everybody on the wonderful presentations. I would second that. And she has questions about the possibility of how particular letters of this collection can be made into a digital humanities project. And maybe, Kelli, you could address that. And also the internationalism of Darlington's botany scope. She's wondering if it extended to only the Atlantic world or beyond to possibly include the Indian Oceanic world. I don't know, Kelli, if you want to talk about the digital humanities aspect of this. You're muted still, okay.
Yeah, well, if I am correct, we are already working on, or Ron, I should say, is working on a repository, I guess, where our transcriptions are going to go eventually. And there's a lot of different, I mean, I'm working on something else now with a collection that we have, and I'm making a little digital exhibition of it. So that's one way it can be done, where you can put things by category or chronologically or something as like museum exhibit objects, essentially. And then you can have, you know, you can put a narrative together and present scans or, you know, the transcriptions and photos of the originals or whatever. So there's lots of different ways you could do it, which is pretty exciting. So I don't know how this one is going to look exactly, but maybe Ron has some info.
I wanted to make a suggestion too, that you could do something time-wise in GIS mapping where you could look, this goes to your second question, Deirdre, where you could kind of chart the spread of his ideas and on a map, have the different locations, a map of the world, and see where they spread. And if anybody's seen the Enlightenment Project out of Stanford, they would see how this kind of works with correspondence. And you look at the different contributors, and you could have it as a very interactive map. And I bet Ron has some other ideas and plans too. But immediately I thought of a kind of a bridge between your second question and the first.
Yeah, great question. And you know, exactly as Dr. Shevlin just said, I'm already loading a lot of this data into a spreadsheet built around the Palladio scheme that the Republic of Letters project uses, so that it will plot it in the same way. So that's one way I'm thinking about projecting this out. Another project that's in the works, though, is I'm going to let the cat out of the bag here, something called Botany on the Brandywine that I'm working on. And for that, I'm trying to collect as many primary sources from both Chester County and Newcastle County, Delaware. I'm using that as the broad definition of the Brandywine Valley. Primary sources in botanical history from all the great botanical names and many of the unknown people and figures, dozens of them really, who worked in the two counties along the watershed. So these Darlington letters would of course be the ones on botany, and especially with local interest would certainly be a part of that. But so would correspondence from Humphrey Marshall and John Jackson and you know, Grace Anna Lewis and some of the other names and figures that come up in this region. So that would be a project I'm building in Scalar. But these things are a little bit further off. We're going to get these letters together and then, yes, certainly pivot to some DH projects. Your question about the Indian Ocean, there's not much. There are some Pacific Island I'm trying to think now what they are actually. There's a sub collection that he obtained with some pieces there, but not much. Mostly his correspondence was European. The herbarium, however, does have some pieces that are, you know, more broadly scattered. And one thing that I can point to specifically is when Darlington was on that ship that I said he spent a year on the ship. They went to Calcutta, and he went to the it was an East India ship, and then so he went to the botanic gardens over there, and he spent time with I think Fitzhugh was the director at the time, and brought back lots of plant specimens. And as soon as he got back to America, if anyone happened to see the book that's out called American Eden, it was out maybe a year or so ago, and it's a great story of David Hozick, who was the New York botanist who tried to create this great garden that would have the species of, everywhere in the world. When Darlington got back, he was well aware of that project, and so as soon as he got back, he sent specimens and seeds to Hozick, so in the hopes that he could use them, and that maybe he could strike up a kind of correspondence in trade. It didn't seem to go too far initially, and of course Darlington got caught up in other work, but there was that Indian connection, where at least he was in India. Of course, that brings up all the questions about colonial obtaining of these things, but nevertheless, that's the one thing I can point to that's a definite.
We have a lot of great questions here. This one's from Peter O'Hara. Did you any of the students, did you find letters that you worked on related to the content of other student letters? I think, Peter, part of this question, the second part got a little cut off. It says, did they find sometimes clear, I don't know if you want to, but did you find, were you working in silos, or were you able, because we are kind of silos today, unless we're on Zoom. I didn't know, the answer, did you find that you were dealing with content that other, you had letters that others, like Kelli, that you may have been working on letters that Chris had, or that one of the Christopher or Christoforos had? It's good that we give your formal names.
I didn't really look at anything that anyone else was doing, honestly, so I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. We did, however, have some sharing meetings, like monthly, like Ron would have some check-in meetings, and towards the end of the spring semester, we kind of came together and had a meeting of like, what was the most interesting things you found, and what were the most challenging aspects of this project. So there was some conversation, but when like working on the letters, I would say mostly everybody stayed in their own little silo.
Yeah. Probably once you finished like more of this project and you start doing searches, then you could see, and people's memory, if you had more meetings, which I know that we're all into other things. But, oh, this is a question. Did you come across evidence of Darlington corresponding in other languages aside from French and English? And this comes from Kelli Billings. Anybody? Were there other languages?
I'm not sure if these students encountered any, except Kelli mentioned the French, but
yeah,
there are other languages that he wrote in. Those letters are not in the letter books. When he was a younger man, in college and just after that, well, medical school, which was really not really college at the time, he corresponded with friends in Latin and German, and they adopted Latin names, and they played this game, this sort of 18th century, game of putting on these personas. So he did play at that, but it wasn't as if he was writing necessarily to a foreign correspondent in their native language. His Latin was pretty good, but it wasn't great. He wanted a nice inscription for his tombstone, and he made his best stab at it, and he gave it to Asa Gray to polish it up. So there's an example of knowing the language quite well, but not feeling like he quite mastered.
But I think, I'm not sure, but well, probably would have been more French. I know during the 19th century, didn't German become more the language of science? Maybe Walt knows this, or somebody else, but I think it was German, because I know even today that sometimes students had German, they've gotten jobs as editorial in science and medical, and they're surprised how happy people are that they have that background in Germany. This one and I'm interested in all these questions, but was Darlington Street in Westchester named after William Darlington?
To the best of my knowledge, it was. Of course, it was, you know, it was already a pretty well-known family, but he was the most prominent resident in town. So that makes great sense to me.
Yeah.
And it's not far from where he lived, so also makes sense.
Oh God, we have tons of new messages. Let me not go out of order here. Let's just see. Did you find any letters, new information on the Chester County Cabinet of Natural Science? And that cabinet comes up a lot in general when people talk about botany.
Yeah, did any of the students, did any of your letters that you worked on touch on that? Okay. There are a lot, and so it's often hard to distinguish when Darlington's writing to someone or someone's writing to Darlington, and he's posing as a representative of the CCCNS, or he's William Darlington. In 1826, he founds the Chester County Cabinet of Natural Science and pretty much devotes himself to it with great passion. So the herbarium that he has been collecting, he gives to the cabinet, and so we still call it the Darlington Herbarium, but it was technically the herbarium of the cabinet from that point forward. Many of the books that are coming in at that point, he's giving directly to the cabinet, building their library. And it's a way for him to also build a community of not just botanists, but geologists and other citizen scientists of the time in town. And so it's a real passionate pet project of his. Unfortunately, it doesn't last. It fades out before he dies. And that's a really interesting story I won't get into right now. But yep, that'll be another presentation we'll give on that. Good question.
We should have a follow-up about the project and an update in the spring. It would be good because we have a lot of questions about this. I don't know if we have we have a lot of very good information provided by Jenna and answers to some of the questions in the chat, some of which she's done out loud. And I think we've done all the questions except one from David. Pardon?
Oh, I was just saying there's one more at least in there.
Yeah, there's a question from David if we have time. I know we're kind of, okay. David asked, how was Darlington viewed by his peers? Was he seen as a prominent botanist while alive or recognized more after his death?
I guess I'll take that one too. He was viewed very well during his lifetime. So I think I quoted, and it's kind of hard to make out, what was being said in that case, but Asa Gray, who was, maybe the greatest name in American botany of the 19th century, who studied under John Tory. Those two are just major names. Tory, in this slideshow, you may have seen, Tory names a genus for Darlington, which is a wonderful plant, by the way, and you really ought to check it out. Darlingtonia californica. And in fact, the author of a great paper on the story of how that genus came to be named is with us tonight, Maura Flannery. I think in the follow-up email we send everyone, I can probably send you a link if that's, I'm not sure it's freely available, but we'll see if you wanted to try and read that. And then, so Tory thinks highly of him. It goes to great lengths to get a new genus named for him when his earlier name is superseded. And Gray thinks highly of him too. They correspond for decades. And Gray calls Darlington the Nestor of American botany. And it's an allusion those guys would have understood, but it meant the wise man. And in that same letter, which Gray is writing to Sir William Jackson Hooker, who's leading Kew Gardens in just outside of London, I mean, a prominent botanist of the world. And also a very close friend of Darlington's and longtime correspondent. There's just this mutual respect. It's not like that extends to everyone practicing botany at the time. And there are names now that are respected more than Darlington's, or that are getting more attention by researchers, Rafinesque, for instance. But at the time, collectively, these men generally dismissed Rafinesque, and Darlington's reputation was almost impeccable. among this crowd. So yes, highly respected during his lifetime, and unfortunately kind of faded away largely after that. But his contributions at the time were quite important and recognized.
Can I
Yes.
just say that I will send you the link to the article because it would be nice if someone read it.
Oh, everyone should.
Great. This was a wonderful presentation. Everybody did a beautiful job. Thank you. I'm shutting up now.
Okay. Thank you, Maura.
And I want to mention,
Maura, I should also say one more thing. Maura also writes a blog called Herbarium World. It's wonderful reading. It's always a new topic, and she's written about Darlington in there too. So you can, if you want to get into this now, there's a great place to start.
oh, I have something. I will send a link to more too about our Washington area group because we're doing something on herbariums in physics, early modern though, period. But Adam Levine wanted to say that we all knew about the Delaware County Institute of Science, founded in 1833, and it still exists in the building in 1867 in Media. And Walt Kressler can tell us more about it. And I also know Jessica Linker, who discovered the counterfeit I'm probably screwing this up, but Ben Franklin designed this kind of printing device, and maybe Adam can help me out here, to protect counterfeiting money. And she found it just a couple years ago at the Delaware Valley Institute. And there it was, and no one had discovered it, and it made the New York Times. There are a lot of people doing history of the book work that go into these archives and find amazing things. And often it's the archive that is not well known that something really wonderful comes out of. And students like Christopher and Kelli and Christoforos are often the ones too doing these discoveries. So
we're about out of time.
yes.
I'm happy to sit here all night and answer questions, but I know people probably were counting on a 7 o'clock wrap. But I will say I'm happy to answer any more questions if people have them. Please, you can email me, or maybe Jenna could pop our emails in the chat quick. And I encourage you, when the time comes, we can do this. Come visit us so we can put a lot of this great material in front of you, and you can turn the pages and you can see up close what we're talking about. And the students didn't even get to experience that, so they're going to get first dibs, and then anyone else is welcome to come in and see this stuff.
And I want to thank, this was a wonderful start to, we've been kind of going under the radar, but for the Westchester University Center for Book History, this was a great way to open it up, and we hope that some of you will come to other presentations. And I'm going to urge, really, there's a lot of interest in having kind of an update in the spring when more of the digital, when you get even more developed. You've already done so much work, so it's just terrific.
So in closing, I just want to say too, thank you again to Kelli, Chris, and I hope you saw the long list of people I put on the PowerPoint. We're just so lucky to have wonderful students that just want to work with these collections. So I think you probably saw that when they spoke tonight, how interested they were and how deeply engaged they are with this work. So it makes my job so easy and much more enjoyable. So thank you to all who participated. And Jenna, there's no way I did any of this, or anyone did any of this without Jenna. So she was sort of the wheelhouse in the whole thing. So
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you much for inviting me.